Welcome to the True Crime Studio. In today's story, a millionaire's life takes an unbelievable turn when he encounters a waitress who looks exactly like his wife, who vanished 20 years ago. What unfolds next is a gripping tale of mystery, love, and second chances. If you're ready for a journey full of shocking revelations, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the True Crime Studio for more captivating stories. Let's dive in.
Richard Thompson adjusted his Italian silk tie while observing the rain that battered the historic streets of Millbrook through the windows of the Palazzo, the most refined restaurant in the hill town. Raindrops ran down the glass, forming patterns that resembled the tears he had shed so many times over the past 20 years. Since Isabella, his wife, had mysteriously disappeared. The restaurant's dining room was partially empty on that Tuesday night. Amber lights reflected off the crystal glasses, creating a cozy atmosphere that contrasted with the storm outside. Richard had been frequenting the place for years, always choosing the same discreet table in the corner near the stone fireplace. There he could lose himself in his memories without being disturbed. At 55, Richard had built an empire in the technology industry, but his fortune did not fill the void left by Isabella. She had departed without a trace during a business trip, 5 months pregnant. The searches were intense, but they never found concrete answers about her whereabouts. The mystery remained, as did the pain of her absence. As he absent-mindedly flipped through the leather menu, something caught his attention. A young waitress was crossing the room with a natural elegance that made him freeze. His heart raced, and for a moment he thought he was having a hallucination. The resemblance was striking. The same honey-colored eyes, the delicate smile, even the peculiar way of walking, as if floating over the marble floor. With trembling hands, Richard let the menu slip onto the table. The sound caught the attention of Peter, the maitre d', who had known him for years. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, approaching with concern. Richard could barely stammer a response, his eyes fixed on the young woman who was now serving a nearby table. "Who is that waitress?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Peter followed his gaze and smiled. "Ah, that's Mary. She started a few months ago. Excellent employee, very dedicated. She came from New York in search of a better life." The information provoked a wave of emotions in Richard. Mary, the name he and Isabella had chosen for their unborn daughter. Could it be possible? The young woman's apparent age, the striking resemblance to Isabella. His heart beat erratically as thousands of possibilities crossed his mind. Gathering courage, Richard asked Peter to call her to his table. As he waited, his restless hands played with the wedding ring he had never taken off. Mary approached with a polite smile, unaware of the turmoil her mere presence was causing. "Good evening, sir. Can I help you with anything?" she asked, and her voice had the same sweetness that Richard remembered in Isabella. He needed a few seconds to regain his composure before responding. "Please, sit down for a moment," he invited, indicating the chair across from him. Faced with her hesitant look, and he added, "I promise I won't take much of your time." Mary glanced at Peter, who nodded discreetly. She sat down, adjusting her uniform apron with delicate gestures that were like vivid flashbacks of Isabella. During the conversation that followed, Richard discovered that Mary had grown up in an orphanage in New York. She had never known her biological parents and, at 18, had decided to seek her own path. She had chosen Millbrook by chance, enchanted by the town during a weekend trip. Every word from her was like a puzzle piece fitting into place. Richard listened attentively, controlling the urge to reveal his suspicions. He couldn't scare her with hasty conclusions, but his instinct screamed that this encounter was not a coincidence. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. At the end of the conversation, Richard made a proposal that surprised them both. He offered Mary a job as his personal assistant. The salary would be 3 times higher than her current one, with all possible benefits. Faced with her suspicious look, he explained that he needed someone young and dedicated to help him modernize some aspects of his company. Mary hesitated, her expression divided between natural distrust and the temptation of opportunity. "Why me?" "You barely know me," she questioned, demonstrating a shrewdness that also reminded him of Isabella. Richard smiled. choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes we need to trust our intuition. You give me confidence, Mary, and I promise you won't regret it if you accept." The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the palazzo, a story was beginning to unfold. A story about destiny, second chances, and long-buried secrets that would finally come to light. Mary promised to think about the proposal, without imagining that conversation would change her life forever. As he watched her walk away to serve other tables, Richard was already planning his next steps. He needed to be sure of his suspicions, but he needed to act with caution. If Mary was really his daughter, this time he wouldn't allow fate to take her away again. A week after the meeting at the Palazzo, Mary crossed the imposing lobby of the Thompson building in downtown Millbrook. The glass and steel building reflected the morning sunlight, creating a spectacle of colors that contrasted with the nervousness she felt. After much reflection, she had decided to accept Richard's proposal, although part of her still questioned the strange coincidence of that opportunity. The heels of her new shoes echoed on the marble floor as she headed towards the reception. She had invested part of her savings in a more appropriate wardrobe for the new work environment. An elegant receptionist, who introduced herself as Sarah, led her to the executive elevator. "Mr. Thompson is waiting for you on the 20th floor," Sarah informed with a professional smile. "He rarely hires people directly, you know. You must be really special." Those words only increased Mary's uneasiness. During the ascent, her reflection in the elevator mirror revealed a 20-year-old young woman trying to look older and more experienced than she really was. Her long brown hair was tied in a discreet bun, and the navy blue suit had been a safe choice for the first day. The doors opened directly into Richard's office, a sophisticated environment with a panoramic view of the hills. He was standing by the window, contemplating the landscape, but turned when he heard her arrival. His smile was warm and, for some inexplicable reason, familiar. "Welcome, Mary," he said, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs. "I hope you feel comfortable here." During the following hours, Richard presented her with her new assignments. Mary would be responsible for organizing his schedule, participating in important meetings, and helping manage the company's social projects. The work was challenging, but she had always been a determined person. "There's something special I want to show you," said Richard, leading her to a side door of his office. Upon opening it, he revealed a smaller but equally elegant room. "This will be your space." The room had a mahogany desk, state-of-the-art computer, and, to Mary's surprise, a small vertical garden with orchids. "Orchids were my wife's favorite flowers," Richard commented, his soft voice laden with nostalgia. "She always said they were like people. They need care and patience to bloom." Mary felt something strange upon hearing that, as if a distant memory was trying to emerge. "They're beautiful," she murmured, approaching the flowers. "I've always had a special connection with orchids. Even in the orphanage I could make them bloom when no one else could." Richard observed her attentively, noticing how she unconsciously touched a small birthmark behind her ear, exactly like Isabella had. His heart raced, but he maintained his composure. He needed to be patient, just like with the orchids. Throughout the day, Richard shared more stories about the company and his life. He talked about how he started from scratch, about his future projects, but whenever he mentioned Isabella, he noticed how Mary showed a special, almost involuntary interest. During lunch, which they shared in the office itself, Mary began to loosen up more. She told about her childhood in the orphanage, the difficulties and dreams. "I always imagined what my parents would be like," she confessed, playing with the food on her plate. "The other children created fantastic stories about their families, but I always felt that the truth about mine was somewhere, waiting to be discovered." Richard swallowed hard, controlling the urge to reveal his suspicions. Instead, he asked about the orphanage documents. If she had access to any information about her origin. "Just the basics," she replied. "I was left there when I was only a few months old, wrapped in a blue blanket with the initials I.T. embroidered. I always wondered what they meant. Isabella Thompson." The initials hit Richard like lightning. That blanket had been a gift he had given to Isabella when they discovered the pregnancy, but he needed more evidence before sharing his suspicions. At the end of the day, Mary was more relaxed and confident. Richard watched her organizing her new desk, arranging each item with the same perfectionism that characterized Isabella. It was like seeing the past and present merging before his eyes. "Tomorrow we'll start with the main projects," he said, preparing to end the workday. "There's a lot of work ahead, but something tells me we make a good team." Mary smiled, that smile that was like a mirror of the past. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Thompson. I promise I won't disappoint you." As he watched her leave, Richard made a call. "I need your help for a discreet investigation," he told his trusted lawyer. "It's about the St. Clair orphanage in New York. I need all the baby admission records between January and December 2003. The search for the truth was just beginning, and Richard knew that each day beside Mary would bring new discoveries. Fate had given him a second chance, and he wouldn't waste it. Autumn painted the streets of Millbrook with golden hues as Mary completed her first month at the company. The adaptation had been surprisingly natural, as if that place had always been her destiny. The young woman was organizing some documents in her room when she found an old photograph that had fallen from a folder. In the time-yellowed image, a young and elegant woman smiled at the camera. Sitting on a garden bench surrounded by orchids, there was something hypnotizing about that smile, something terribly familiar. Mary felt a shiver run down her spine when she turned the photo and read the inscription, "Isabella, Orchid Garden, 2003. "I see you found one of my favorite photos." Richard's voice startled her. He was standing at the door, observing her with an enigmatic expression. "This is Isabella, my wife. The photo was taken a few months before her disappearance." Mary couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. "She was very beautiful," she murmured, feeling an inexplicable connection to the image. "And these orchids, are they the same species we have here in the office?" Richard approached, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "Yes, she created this garden. Isabella had a special gift with orchids, just like you." He paused, carefully choosing his next words. "You know, Mary, sometimes fate has mysterious ways of bringing people together." At that moment, they were interrupted by Sarah, who entered hurriedly with an envelope in hand. "Mr. Thompson, the documents you requested have arrived." Richard took the envelope, thanking with a nod. For the rest of the afternoon, Mary couldn't fully concentrate on work. Her thoughts kept returning to Isabella's photograph. There was something in her eyes, in the way she smiled, that awakened strange sensations, like submerged memories trying to surface. At the end of the workday, Richard called her for a conversation in his office. The sun was setting, tinting the sky pink and orange, creating an almost magical atmosphere through the panoramic windows. "Mary," he began, his voice softer than normal, "I'd like to tell you a story. It's about Isabella, about what really happened 20 years ago." He narrated how he met Isabella in business school, the happy marriage they had, the dreams they shared. He talked about the much-desired pregnancy and plans for the future, but he also mentioned family tensions, especially with Edward, Isabella's brother, who had never approved of the marriage. "Isabella was 5 months pregnant when she disappeared," Richard continued, his voice choked with emotion. "So it was an apparently common business trip, but she never returned. The investigations led nowhere, as if she had simply vanished into thin air." Mary listened attentively, feeling her heart beat faster and faster. Something in that story resonated deeply within her being, as if each word was a piece of a puzzle that she carried inside without knowing. "Mr. Thompson," she interrupted, hesitantly, "why are you telling me all this?" Richard stood up, taking the envelope that Sarah had brought earlier. "Because I found something in the records of the orphanage where you grew up." He pulled some documents from the envelope. "In December 2003, a baby was left there, wrapped in a blanket with the initials IT. The date coincides exactly with the period when my daughter should have been born." The air seemed to become denser in the office. Mary felt her hands tremble as she took the documents Richard was extending to her. Among them was a photo of the blue blanket she had always kept as the only memento of her origin. "There's more," Richard continued, his voice now almost a whisper. "I found this among Isabella's belongings." He showed an old, yellowed letter. It's a letter she wrote days before disappearing, expressing concern about some suspicious attitudes of her brother Edward. Mary read the documents in silence, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The coincidences were many. The dates, the initials, her inexplicable connection with orchids, the physical resemblance to Isabella that everyone in the office had already commented on. "You think I—" She couldn't complete the sentence, her voice failing with emotion. Richard approached, his eyes also watery. "I believe you are my daughter, Mary, the daughter I thought I had lost 20 years ago. But I need you to know that I'm not just looking to confirm a suspicion. I'm trying to understand a mystery that changed many lives." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of the city and the accelerated beating of two hearts that, perhaps Chiu, had always been destined to meet again. The truth was beginning to emerge, but there was still much to be discovered, and not all revelations would be easy to accept. The following morning dawned cloudy, reflecting the whirlwind of emotions that stirred Mary's thoughts. She had spent the night awake, turning over every detail of the conversation with Richard, repeatedly examining Isabella's photo that he had allowed her to take home. In her small rented apartment, Mary opened the old box where she kept her few belongings from the orphanage. The blue blanket with the initials IT, now faded by time, seemed to tell a different story in light of recent revelations. Her fingers traced the embroidered letters as fragmented memories of her childhood emerged in her mind. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Richard, his voice conveying the same mixture of anxiety and hope that she felt. "Mary, I know it's a lot to process, but I'd like to show you something important. Can I pick you up in an hour?" During the journey in the luxurious car, the silence between them was comfortable, as if they already shared a connection beyond words. Richard drove through the winding streets of Millbrook until they reached a beautiful colonial-style house, surrounded by a lush garden. "This was the house where Isabella and I lived," he explained, parking. "I kept everything as she left it, hoping that one day I could share this with our daughter." As they entered, Mary was enveloped by a strange sense of familiarity. The soft scent of orchids filled the environment, coming from a winter garden that occupied part of the living room. The walls were decorated with photographs that told the love story of Richard and Isabella. "This was the room we prepared for you," said Richard, opening a door on the upper floor. The room, painted in soft shades of green, remained untouched. An old elaborately carved wooden crib occupied the center, and on the shelves, children's books and small teddy bears awaited a baby who never came to occupy that space. Mary approached an antique dresser, where a music box rested. As she opened it, a soft melody filled the room. "This music," she murmured, feeling tears in her eyes. "I know it. I've always heard it in my dreams, but never knew where it came from." Richard had to lean against the wall, visibly moved. "Isabella played this music box every night, saying that you already recognized the melody inside her." He paused, catching his breath. "She said it would be our special song." As they explored the house, Richard shared stories about Isabella, her passion for classical literature, her talent for painting, her dream of creating a foundation to help underprivileged children. Each revealed detail created a bridge between the past and the present, filling voids that Mary had carried throughout her life. In the library, Richard opened a photo album. "Look at this," he said, showing a photo of young Isabella. "You have the same birthmark as her, behind your left ear." Mary instinctively touched the small, crescent-shaped mark that she had always considered unique. The coincidences were accumulating, transforming into increasingly concrete evidence. "There's something else I need to show you," said Richard, heading to a safe embedded in the wall. From inside it, he retrieved an old diary. This was Isabella's diary. "I found it recently, hidden among some books. She recorded her suspicions about Edward here and some important company documents that he was trying to manipulate." Flipping through the diary, Mary discovered an Isabella different from the serene image in the photographs. The pages revealed a worried woman who sensed that something was wrong, but tried to protect her growing family. In the last entry, Richard continued, his voice tense, Isabella mentions a meeting with Edward in New York, where she intended to confront him about documents she had discovered. It was the last time anyone saw her. A distant thunder announced an approaching storm, creating an even more intense atmosphere in the room. Mary closed the diary, feeling the weight of the story that was beginning to unfold. "What happened to Edward?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He took over as vice president of the company after Isabella's disappearance," Richard replied, a determined gleam in his eyes. "He built an image of a respectable businessman, but I always felt there was something dark in his actions. Now, with you here, the pieces are starting to fit together." The rain began to fall outside, its drops creating a water curtain on the library windows. Mary observed her reflection in the glass, seeing for the first time not only her own features, but those of Isabella, those of Richard, a genetic heritage that time couldn't erase. "What do we do now?" she asked, turning to Richard. "First," he answered, "we need to be absolutely sure. Tomorrow we can do a DNA test. Then we need to discover the whole truth, not just for us, but for Isabella." The storm increased in intensity, but inside that library, father and daughter began to build a bridge over the 20-year abyss that had separated them. Each revelation was a step towards a greater truth, a truth that could finally bring justice and healing to long, open wounds. The most renowned clinical analysis laboratory in Millbrook was practically empty on that Monday morning. Mary and Richard awaited the DNA test results in a private room, the silence between them laden with expectation. After a week that seemed endless, the sealed envelope rested on the mahogany table. "Are you sure you want to open it now?" Richard asked, his hands resting on the envelope. Mary nodded, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from her chest. The result was unequivocal: 99% probability of paternity. That number transformed suspicions into certainties, theories into facts. Mary was, without a shadow of doubt, the daughter of Richard and Isabella Thompson. Silent tears ran down both their faces as they absorbed the scientific confirmation of something their hearts already knew. Richard extended his hand across the table, gently holding Mary's. "I always knew this day would come," he said, his voice choked. "From the first time I saw you in the restaurant, something inside me recognized you." Back at the office, father and daughter began to plan their next steps. The truth about their kinship was just the beginning. There were still many unanswered questions about Isabella's disappearance and Edward's role in the whole story. "We need to be cautious," Richard warned, closing the blinds in his office. "Edward is a powerful and influential man. If he discovers we're investigating the past, he may try to stop us." Mary was leafing through her mother's diary again, looking for clues in the records from 2 decades ago. "Here," she pointed to a specific entry. "Mom mentions a folder with documents that she kept in a safe place. She writes about a safe in a bank branch." Richard's eyes widened, an old memory surfacing in his mind. The central bank. Isabella had a safe there. "I never got access because it was in her name, but now I can request access as a legal heir," Mary completed, understanding the plan. In the days that followed, father and daughter worked discreetly to gather the necessary documentation. The DNA test, certificates and documents from the orphanage formed a consistent dossier that proved Mary's identity. The legal process for recognition of paternity was initiated with the help of the best lawyers. The news began to circulate in the company corridors, generating whispers and speculations. Edward, who was traveling on business, returned hastily upon hearing the news. His normally controlled face showed signs of disturbance when he burst into Richard's office. "What's this story I'm hearing?" he demanded, his voice tense. "Have you gone mad, Richard? After 20 years, you invent that you've found your daughter." Richard remained calm, years of suspicions crystallizing into certainties in the face of his brother-in-law's exaggerated reaction. "It's not an invention, Edward. I have concrete proof. Mary is my daughter with Isabella." Edward's face visibly paled. His eyes scanned the office, lingering for a moment on Isabella's portrait on the wall. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to himself than to Richard. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can," Richard replied, opening a folder on his desk. "I have the DNA test, documents from the orphanage, and soon we'll have access to Isabella's safe at the bank. The mention of the safe made Edward stagger slightly. He leaned on the nearest chair, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. At this moment, Mary entered the office. Edward stared at her, as if seeing a ghost, the resemblance to Isabella even more evident under the late afternoon light. "Uncle Edward," she said, her voice firm, despite her inner nervousness. "I think we have a lot to talk about." The atmosphere became charged with tension. Edward alternated glances between Mary and Richard, like a cornered animal. "This is absurd," he finally said, heading for the door. "You don't know what you're getting into." After his stormy exit, Richard and Mary exchanged significant looks. Edward's reaction only confirmed their suspicions. He knew much more than he let on about Isabella's disappearance. "Tomorrow we'll go to the bank," Richard decided. "Whatever Isabella kept in that safe, Edward fears we'll discover it." Mary nodded, feeling they were getting closer and closer to unraveling the mystery that had changed their lives. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together, revealing an image that, although painful, needed to come to light. That night, while organizing her desk to leave, Mary found an envelope that someone had slid under the door. Inside it, a single photograph, Isabella out pregnant, in front of an unknown house. On the back, a handwritten message, "Not all truths should be revealed." The morning was exceptionally cold when Richard and Mary arrived at the central bank. The imposing building, with its classic architecture, seemed to guard not only material values, but also secrets long buried in time. The manager received them in his private room, carefully examining the documentation that proved Mary's identity as Isabella's legitimate heir. After several calls and verifications, they were finally led to the safe area. "The safe hasn't been opened in 20 years, the manager explained, consulting the record. "According to our procedures, we perform annual maintenance, but the content remains intact since the last time Mrs. Isabella Thompson was here." The metallic sound of the key turning in the lock echoed through the silent room. Mary held Richard's hand firmly, both tense with anticipation of what they might find. Inside the safe, there was a brown leather folder, some yellowed envelopes, and a small jewelry box. Richard immediately recognized the folder. It was identical to the one Isabella mentioned in her diary. "Let's take everything to analyze in a more private place," Richard suggested, noticing the manager's excessive interest in the safe's contents. Back in Richard's office, father and daughter began to examine the documents. The folder contained contracts, bank records, and a series of notes made by Isabella. The evidence pointed to an elaborate scheme of diverting company resources, orchestrated by Edward. "Look at this," said Mary, showing a series of suspicious bank transfers. Edward was diverting money to overseas accounts since before Mum's disappearance. Richard examined the documents, his face hardening. Isabella must have discovered the scheme. That's why she was so worried in the weeks before disappearing. In the small jewelry box, they found something even more surprising, an old flash drive and a hastily written note by Isabella. "To whoever finds this, the truth is in the files. Edward is not who he appears to be. If something happens to me, look in the country house in Hillsdale. The key is with the housekeeper, Maria." Mary searched the name on the computer. Maria Conroy still lives in Hillsdale. We can find her today. While they were organizing a discreet visit to the former housekeeper, they were surprised by a call from reception. Edward was coming up for an emergency board meeting. "He must have been informed about our visit to the bank," Richard concluded. "We need to act quickly." Mary put the documents in her bag, preparing to leave discreetly. "I'll look for Maria while you deal with the board. The less Edward suspects of our movements, the better." Richard agreed, hugging his daughter tightly. "Be careful. Edward might be desperate now that we're close to the truth." As Mary left the building through a side exit, Richard prepared to face his brother-in-law on the board. 20 years of lies and manipulations were about to come to light, and he needed to play his cards wisely. In the elevator, Mary clutched the flash drive in her hand, feeling that she was getting closer and closer to discovering what really happened to her mother. The truth, however painful it might be, needed to be revealed. The day was just beginning, and the next few hours promised to reveal secrets that would forever change the destiny of the Thompson family. The road to Hillsdale wound through the hills. while Mary drove with determination. Maria Conroy's address was scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper in her pocket, and each mile traveled brought her closer to the answers she sought. In his office, Richard faced a tense board meeting. Edward had called an extraordinary session, claiming concerns about the company's stability in light of the recent family events. "Gentlemen of the board," Edward began, his voice studiously controlled, "I am deeply concerned about our president's erratic behavior. This absurd story about a lost daughter is negatively affecting our business." Richard remained serene, observing the faces around the table. Some showed genuine concern, others seemed more interested in the drama unfolding. "If you'll allow me," Richard responded, opening a folder on the table, "I'd like to share some information I recently discovered about the company's financial management over the last 20 years. Edward's face visibly paled. Meanwhile, Mary arrived at a modest house on the outskirts of Hillsdale. Maria Conroy, a lady in her 70s, received her with eyes wide with surprise. "My goodness," exclaimed the lady, bringing her hands to her face. "It's like seeing Mrs. Isabella again." Maria invited Mary in, serving her coffee while sharing memories of the past. "Your mother was a kind soul, child. In the last days before leaving, she was very distressed. She always came here, kept documents in her old room." "Does the country house still exist?" Mary asked, anxious. "Yes, but it's been abandoned for years. No one ever claimed the property after your mother's disappearance." Maria fetched an old key from a kitchen drawer. "Your mother made me promise I'd keep this. She said one day someone would come looking." Back in the boardroom, Richard was presenting evidence of the financial irregularities discovered in the safe's documents. The board members listened in shocked silence as he detailed the scheme of diversions. "This is a setup," Edward exploded, rising abruptly. "Richard is trying to defame me to justify this ridiculous story about his supposed daughter." "The story isn't ridiculous, Edward," Richard calmly replied, "and you know that better than anyone. After all, it was you who ensured that Mary was left at that orphanage in New York." A heavy silence fell over the room. The board members exchanged tense glances, while Edward seemed to struggle to maintain control. In the abandoned country house, Mary walked through the dusty rooms, her flashlight illuminating covered furniture and paintings on the walls. In Isabella's old room, she found an antique desk with a false drawer. Inside it, there was a diary different from the one found earlier, along with a series of photographs and a sealed envelope addressed to Richard. The pages of the diary revealed Isabella's growing anguish as she discovered her brother's manipulations. She had gathered enough evidence to expose Edward's scheme, but feared for her safety and that of her unborn child. The last entry, dated the day of her disappearance, contained a shocking revelation. Edward had threatened to expose old family secrets that could destroy not only the company, but also the Thompsons' reputation. Mary photographed each page with her cell phone, immediately sending them to Richard. The revelations could be decisive for the outcome of the board meeting. Meanwhile, in the envelope addressed to Richard, there was a letter that would change everything. Isabella not only revealed Edward's plan, but also left specific instructions on how to protect her daughter and the company. The sun was beginning to set when Mary found the last and most important piece of evidence, a set of documents that Isabella had hidden inside a hollow book. There was the definitive evidence of Edward's manipulation and the true reason for her disappearance. With trembling hands, Mary picked up her phone to call Richard. The truth, finally complete, was about to come to light, and nothing more could stop it. The sky was darkening over Millbrook when Mary hurriedly entered the Thompson Technology Building. Her heart was racing, the discoveries from the country house weighing in her bag and on her conscience. The receptionist, recognizing her, quickly waved her to the executive elevator. "The board meeting is still happening, miss," she informed. "Your father asked for you to come up as soon as you arrived." On the 20th floor, the air was charged with tension. Mary could hear raised voices coming from the meeting room. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. The scene she found was chaotic. Edward was standing, his face red with anger, pointing accusingly at Richard. The board members seemed divided, some shocked, others confused. "Ah, so the lost heiress finally appears." Edward mocked upon seeing her. Come to watch the destruction of the company your mother loved so much. Richard stood up, extending his hand to Mary. Daughter, did you find something? Mary nodded, her voice firm despite her nervousness. I found everything, Dad. The truth about what happened to Mom. About what Uncle Edward did. She began to spread the documents on the meeting table, fraudulent contracts, records of illegal bank transfers, and Isabella's diary. The board members leaned in, examining the evidence with growing astonishment. This is a farce, Edward shouted, trying to grab the papers. Richard stopped him, holding his arm firmly. Enough lies, Edward, said Richard, his voice laden with 2 decades of pent-up pain. It's time for the truth. Mary then revealed the contents of Isabella's letter and the last entries in the diary. The story that unfolded left everyone in the room in stunned silence. Isabella had discovered not only Edward's frauds, but also an even darker secret. Edward wasn't really her brother. He had been illegally adopted by the Thompson family as a child, a favor to an influential family who wanted to get rid of an unwanted son. This secret, if revealed, would threaten not just the company, but the entire family's reputation. When Isabella confronted Edward with her discoveries, he panicked. Fearing to lose everything, Edward devised a plan to silence her. However, he didn't have the courage to cause physical harm to his sister. Instead, he forced her to disappear, threatening to expose the adoption secret and destroy the reputation of the family she loved so much. Isabella, pregnant and fearing for the life of her unborn child, agreed to step away. Edward arranged a new identity for her in a distant city, with the promise that one day she could return. But that day never came. Isabella died in a car accident years later, far from her family and without ever having known her daughter. As Mary narrated the story, silent tears ran down Richard's face. Edward had collapsed into a chair, all his arrogance evaporated. Why? Edward? Richard asked, his voice choked. Why maintain this lie for so long? Edward raised his eyes, defeated. At first, it was fear. Then it was greed. I had already gone too far to turn back. The board members exchanged looks of shock and disbelief. One of them, the oldest, stood up. Mr. Thompson, Miss Mary, on behalf of the board, I apologize for not having noticed what was happening. We will take all necessary measures to correct this situation. In the days that followed, a series of changes occurred at Thompson Technology. Edward was removed from his duties, and the authorities were notified about the frauds. Richard, on with the support of the board, initiated a broad restructuring of the company. Mary, now officially recognized as the heiress, took an active role in the company, bringing new ideas and a fresh vision to the business. She also dedicated herself to honoring her mother's memory, creating a foundation in Isabella's name to help orphaned children. On a sunny afternoon, weeks after the revelations, Richard and Mary visited the cemetery where Isabella had been buried under her false name. With the help of the authorities, they managed to transfer the body to Millbrook. In front of the new grave, father and daughter remained silent, their hands intertwined. The mystery had been solved. The truth revealed. Although the past couldn't be changed, the future opened before in front of the new grave. Father and daughter remained silent, their hands intertwined. The mystery had been solved, the truth revealed. Although the past couldn't be changed, the future opened before them and full of possibilities. She would be proud of you, Richard said softly, looking at Mary. Mary smiled through her tears. Of both of us, Dad. She would be proud of both of us. As they left the cemetery, the sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. It was a new beginning for the Thompsons, a chance to honor Isabella's legacy and build a future based on the truth and love that united them. In the months that followed, Mary and Richard worked tirelessly to rebuild not only the company, but also their relationship. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. As if making up for lost time, Thompson Technology underwent a significant transformation under their joint leadership. Richard's experience combined with Mary's fresh perspective and innovative ideas led the company to new heights. They implemented ethical business practices and focused on developing technologies that could positively impact society. Mary took a special interest in the company's charitable arm, expanding it into the Isabella Thompson Foundation. The foundation focused on supporting orphanages and programs for underprivileged children, ensuring that no child would have to go through what Mary had experienced. As for Edward, he faced the consequences of his actions. After a highly publicized trial, he was sentenced to prison for fraud and embezzlement. The revelation of his true origins caused a stir in Millbrook's high society, but the Thompsons chose to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on past deceptions. 1 year after the revelations, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when Mary had first stepped into Richard's office, father and daughter stood in Isabella's beloved orchid garden. The flowers were in full bloom, their delicate petals a testament to the care and attention they received. "You know," Mary said, gently touching an orchid, "I always felt a connection to these flowers, even before I knew about Mom. It's like a part of her was always with me." Richard nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "Isabella always said that orchids were like people, unique, requiring patience and understanding to thrive. She would be amazed to see how you've made this garden flourish." As they walked through the garden, they discussed plans for the future. Mary had been working on a new project, a tech initiative to connect orphaned children with potential adoptive families. Using advanced matching algorithms and virtual reality to bridge distances and create connections. "I think this could really make a difference," Mary explained enthusiastically. "If we can help even a fraction of the children out there find loving homes, it would be worth every effort." Richard listened with pride, recognizing in Mary the same passion and determination that had driven Isabella. "Your mother would have loved this idea," he said. "In fact, I think I remember her mentioning something similar once, long ago. She always wanted to use our resources to help others." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Richard pulled out a small box from his pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this," he said, handing it to Mary. Inside the box was a delicate silver locket. When Mary opened it, she found a tiny photograph of Isabella on one side, and on the other, an inscription. "To my darling daughter, may you always bloom where you're planted." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes as she clutched the locket. "She had this made for me." Richard nodded. "She commissioned it just before she disappeared. I found it in her things but could never bring myself to open it until now. I think she'd want you to have it." As Mary put on the locket, a sense of completion washed over her. The missing piece of her life's puzzle had finally fallen into place. She was no longer just Mary, the orphan from New York, but Mary Thompson, daughter of Richard and Isabella, heir to a legacy of love, innovation, and compassion. "Thank you, Dad," she said, embracing Richard, "for everything." As they walked back to the house, arm in arm, the last rays of sunlight caught the silver of Mary's locket, making it shine. It was a beacon of hope, a symbol of a family reunited and a future bright with promise. In the years that followed, the Thompson name became synonymous not just with technological innovation, but with ethical business practices and philanthropic efforts. Mary and Richard's story inspired many, reminding the world that it's never too late for second chances, and that the bonds of family can overcome even the greatest of obstacles. The orchid garden remained a special place for both of them, a living memorial to Isabella and a symbol of their own relationship, carefully nurtured, resilient, and forever blooming. As for the old Palazzo restaurant where their story began, it became a landmark in Millbrook. Locals would point it out to visitors, telling the tale of the millionaire who found his long-lost daughter. The table where Richard had first seen Mary was marked with a small plaque, a reminder that sometimes fate has a way of bringing people together in the most unexpected ways. Mary often found herself sitting at that very table, looking out at the rain-streaked windows, marveling at how a single moment can change the course of a life. She would touch her locket, feeling connected to both her past and her future, grateful for the twists of fate that had brought her home. And so, the story of the Thompsons continued to unfold, each day bringing new challenges and triumphs. But no matter what life threw their way, Richard and Mary faced it together, their bond strengthened by the truth they had uncovered and the love they shared. In Millbrook and beyond, their tale became a modern legend, a reminder that sometimes The greatest treasures are those we thought we had lost forever.
Thank you for watching this incredible story here on the True Crime Studio. This tale reminds us that life is full of unexpected twists, and the power of love and hope can bring light, even in the darkest times. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the True Crime Studio for more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.